Is there some inner essence that is the heart of what we are? A soul, a sanctuary within us the world cannot reach? Or must we just accept what science says, that there is no ghost in the machine? But if we have no soul, why do we feel as we do? The language of soul, psyche, Atman, may strike us today as too archaic to believe in. But is there behind the language some fundamental truth about being human we should not ignore? In this modern world, what do we mean by the word soul?
I think when people use the word soul now culturally, they use it for whatever is the true nature of themselves. My soul is my kind of essence, the heart of me, and it's not to do with religious doctrine. Most people feel that there's so much more to them than the person who takes a shopping trolley around Sainsbury's or even has a cup of tea with a friend. More because people have profound thoughts, profound feelings, a hint, a little glimpse, an opening of a door of the totality of themselves. And that, I think, is what we mean when, in very loose terms, we talk about the soul.
That irreducible feeling of an inner mental essence is not something we are taught. It's there inside us even before we understand the word.
We often have a sense of being an inner entity, and I think this starts very early in childhood. And as soon as you realize that you're having thoughts and people can't know what thoughts you're having, you have this sense of you, your innerness, you as a hidden thing, not just a totally visible human being. There's no doubt that we have this sense of there being an inner mental something, which is in some way fundamentally what we are. The question is, can that sense of self be justified? Can it be shown to be veridical?
There was a time when we knew what that sensation of an inner being was. It was our soul talking. It belonged to God and one day would return to him. But in the 18th century, in what we now call the Enlightenment, new thinkers began to question the primacy of the soul. They were fascinated less by our likeness to God, more by what makes each of us different. And that was not what the soul did, it was what we did.
There's an important transition at the time of the Enlightenment between just accepting what the church told you, that you had a soul which was God's and not yours, and the discovery of this independent humanity, this self-reflexivity, this possible exploration that you might make as a human being, and try to make an effort to discover who and what you were as person, rather than just a soul in the terms that the church had taught you that you were.
In the Renaissance, there was a much more emphasis on individualism and on trying to develop the uniqueness and the creativity that stemmed from the uniqueness of an individual, individuals beginning to be encouraged to discover what was different about them from someone else. And also then you begin to get the glorification of the artist as a kind of creative force. Another important point would be the writings of Descartes at the beginning of the Enlightenment. He says that we have to return to the cogito, to the experience of I think, or I experience as the only thing that we can have any certitude about. And that certainly contrasts very markedly with an earlier religious kind of consciousness where certitude would lie outside oneself.
According to this argument, before the Enlightenment, people inhabited their sense of self less self-consciously. They looked through the self, as through a lens. But during the Enlightenment, the lens itself became the object of wonder and scrutiny. We began to look at it rather than through it.
The effect of Descartes, I think, was to make us take the inner self much more seriously and to rely upon it rather than upon things external to the self. To feel that we were the source of we're one is one's own foundation.
So there's a whole possibility for the writing of poetry and of painting and the visual arts and in the literary arts, where people begin to think of the great question, who am I? Not a question before, because you had been told who you were.
The journey from being told who you were to asking, who am I? The journey from authority to inquiry, from soul to self, marks the birth of the modern age. According to Professor Harold Bloom, it really began with Shakespeare.
Though there are many concepts of the self before Shakespeare, he so represents the self in his great protagonists that I think he redefines the whole question of what a self is. No one before Shakespeare anywhere near so persuasively is able to represent a human self. And no one before or since Shakespeare has invented so many separate selves, each with a voice distinctively her or his own.
According to Bloom, Shakespeare can be said to have invented the modern self, because when his characters look inside themselves, they do not find the certainty of a God-given soul, but the question, what am I? And the revolutionary answer he gives them and us is that we are all self-made, not God-made. We weave ourselves out of our own thoughts, words, and experiences.
The great figures in Shakespeare startle themselves because they overhear themselves. If you've never heard yourself on a tape before, it startles you. You don't recognize that as being your voice. I'm always surprised, being a big fat fellow, that my voice isn't a deep, low voice. But of course it isn't. And I know that only because I've heard it in reproduction. I think that when Shakespeare's great figures overhear themselves and are startled into a kind of awareness of self different than they've experienced before, that there really is a moment. It can be only the briefest of moments, but there is an actual moment which, you and I can see all the time when we overhear ourselves, in which you don't for a moment realize that it is you who is speaking, in which one is surprised, so that something in one gets turned around. And out of that moment of non-recognition comes the will to change. Shakespeare effectually turns the question of a self into a conscious fiction. His great characters are free artists of themselves.
What a piece of work is a man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties. In action, how like an angel, In apprehension, how like a god. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Dust, 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 dust.
Shakespeare's insight that we are free to create our own story was a liberation. Who needs a soul when you can have a self? Why allow God to pin you in place when you can be free to make of yourself what you will? When we believed the answers to the riddle of our existence lay in the contemplation of the soul, we at least had the serenity of God-given certainty. The self had changed all that. In place of certainty, we had the exhilaration of freedom, but it was an uneasy freedom.
Liberating, empowering, those ideas would be for people, and those experiences would be for people, but also quite frightening. It could lead to a lot of angst. And I think that's still true for us today. For anyone with, as it were, a blank sheet of exploration, asking, well, who am I? What place do I have in society, in the world, in the universe? Then that can lead to a feeling of lostness. So there's both great liberation, great potential for depth, but also the possibility of great angst.
And this destructive, doubting side of the self had been there from the very beginning.
It is a great paradox about Shakespeare, which I'm only beginning to understand, that at one and the same time, he gives you selves as overwhelming as Sir John Falstaff or Cleopatra, and yet also gives you Hamlet and Iago, who so profoundly realize the nothingness at the heart of the self.
The nothingness was not the vacuum of man without a soul, but a self without purpose and meaning. The self as victim of the soulless world it had created, which was now beyond its control. It was the end of innocence. The journey from soul to self was the philosophical revolution upon which the modern Western world was founded. The mystical gave way to the rational, the spiritual gave way to the material. We were no longer souls in God's world, but things in a world of things. But in order to validate this switch from soul to self, the self had to be located.
The notion of the self as a thing is somehow woven into the intellectual tapestry that you pick up when you grow up in the culture we've grown up in. And we're stuck with that notion. They've looked for it. They've honestly looked for it. 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s saw an enormous amount of very good work. For example, direct stimulation of the brain. Direct stimulation of the brain revealed that different bits of the brain, if stimulated, would result in different sorts of experiences. But you never found anywhere where, if you stimulated, the patient would feel that the action was theirs. There didn't seem to be a place where you could find the will, stimulate that, and suddenly somebody says, I want to do this. Once you begin to go down that route, there's nowhere for the self to live. And that has caused eliminativists to say, well, there you are. I told you this thing that we experience is a phenomenological mistake. And we know it feels like that, we feel like that, but really there's nothing of that sort there. There's no essential thing which is the self.
So when their rational material search found nothing, their rational material conclusion was, there is nothing to find.
What was going on up to the end of the 19th century in experimental psychology was that they were trying to measure introspective features, consciousness features, and what they realized that it was just they couldn't pin it down, couldn't be quantified. So behaviorism started off as a purely methodological step which said, well, we know there is all this inner consciousness stuff, but we can't do science with it, so what we'll do is we'll just study things that are measurable. So behaviorism at first was merely methodological and didn't deny the existence of consciousness at all. But then the philosophers got hold of it, and they turned a merely methodological program into a metaphysical lunacy. They started to deny the very existence of consciousness.
And the self.
And the self, of course, also, because that goes with it. But it is actually the craziest thing that has ever been said in the whole history of philosophy.
It was a massive misdirection. Ignore completely what you feel inside, the philosophers said. You are just the story of your bodies and your material brains.
Psychologists, philosophers, scientists of the mind generally will say, yes, of course, there's a natural folk psychology language of what it's like to be. But with sufficiently good work, we will realize where that comes from. We will be able to explain what that sense of having an inside is without any special sorts of explanations like souls or vital forces or whatever.
Science had declared there was no little man inside our heads who sees what we see and pulls the levers. How then to account for the persistent feeling that there is? It was Michael Gazzaniga who offered a solution. He proposed an ingenious way of giving us the feeling of having a self without having to invoke a little man inside our heads. His idea came from revolutionary treatment for severe epileptics, which involved cutting their brains in two. Experiments on animals suggested that both halves would continue to function, but one side wouldn't know what the other was doing.
Could that possibly be true for the human? It just seemed phantasmagoric at the time that the left hand literally would not know what the right hand was doing. An apple in the left hand could not be matched by an apple placed in the right hand. I mean, how could that be?
What science knew was that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and vice versa. And certain functions, like speech, came from one side only.
We set up an experiment where we had the left hemisphere doing a task, and simultaneously we had the right hemisphere doing a task. And what that means is the left hemisphere can talk to you about the one it's doing, because that's where the language system is. But the right hemisphere doesn't talk, but yet it can process the information and carry out an activity. So you can get the right hemisphere left hand to point to objects and pick things up. And really, the left hemisphere doesn't know why it's doing it. because the information has been isolated in this right disconnected hemisphere because of the surgery.
In other words, the problem for the split brain patient was that although the hemisphere that talks, the left hemisphere, can see what the right is doing, it doesn't know why.
The classic test was we showed a picture of a chicken to the right visual field, left hemisphere, and the subject could choose one of 4 choices, one of which was a picture of a chicken claw that was most related to the chicken. And to the right hemisphere, we showed a picture of a snow scene, and there was 4 objects for the right hemisphere left hand to choose, one of which was a shovel, which was the most related thing, a snow shovel. So we show these pictures, and the first case we ran this on, case PS, immediately points to the chicken claw and to the shovel. And we said, Paul, why are you doing that?
What the patient replied led Gazzaniga not only to come up with an explanation of the self, but also to say where the self was located.
And he looks up and he goes, oh, well, he says, the chicken claw goes with the chicken, and then he's looking down at his left hand, pointing at the shovel, and the left hemisphere is sort of watching this activity go on and cooks up a theory to be consistent with the actual behavior. And he goes, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. So he immediately generates a theory to explain a behavior that makes it consistent with the overall cognitive set that he has. So then you get this idea, well, he's interpreting his own behaviors, his overt behaviors, to be consistent with a storyline. And we finally realized that there is something unique in the left hemisphere with respect to these cognitive activities. It's constantly trying to seek patterns, seek understanding towards our actual behavior, felt states, and all the rest. It's trying to tell a story that's consistent with what's going on. And that becomes the narrative. That becomes the self-story of who we are and what we're doing and how we're interacting throughout life.
So that was the answer. Our feeling that there was a self inside our bodies was an illusion. It was just a sign that the interpretive capacity in the left hemisphere of our brain was working.
I'd like to give a lecture entitled, "The Left Hemisphere, Don't Leave Home Without It." It is the thinking, language-based, hypothesis-generating hemisphere. It is the one that does the heavy lifting for our cognitive life. If you think of it as a theory-generating hemisphere, how do A and B relate? That interpreter chip, that little wiring, is in our left hemisphere, and it doesn't seem to be in the right.
Gazzaniga had solved the problem of the self as a ghost in the machine by replacing it with a mechanism, a bundle of neurons whose effect is to create just the impression of there being a ghost in the machine.
Ultimately, they're circuits. That's the assumption of neuroscience. There's a circuit in there that finds you the self, always asking the question, what's the meaning of this? Why did I do that? And then you seek an answer. It all comes from a very basic system. It's the added chip that says, how does A relate to B?
The interpreter had finally provided a scientific underpinning for Bloom's idea of the self as story, but at a cost, because now there was only the story. The self was merely a byproduct of the story, just a narrative construction to help the story along.
No one would argue that person A has a theory about person B, right? You have a theory about your spouse, your children, your father, your mother. You have it stored in your brain. You respond to them in certain ways. Why is it a big jump to say you have a theory about yourself? We have a system for generating a story about ourselves, and it can take the next step and convince itself that it is the one in charge.
So a bundle of wiring in the left hemisphere tells a story about having a self and then believes it. The question is, should we? How much should we trust the interpreter and the story it tells us of what we are?
I don't think Gazzaniga's view of a narration in the left hemisphere is complete. He sees this interpreter as being the thing that is actually us, but it isn't the whole of the self at all. It seems to me that what the sort of narrative that the left hemisphere is creating is one which is designed to explain what it is we're doing now and why we're here at this moment. So it tries to make sense, often I think quite spuriously, because it's only got part of the data, if you like, it's only got part of the information to work on. It's only got the bits that it's consciously aware of, actually. So it creates a story which helps us get through. And it's a very optimistic one, you know, in keeping with the notion that the left hemisphere is essentially an optimist. Because it feels it can control things, it knows that it will be able to order everything so that everything will be all right in the future. And rationalists, utilitarians, functionalists have always had a view of society that is ameliorist, that they will be able to sort things out.
Have we made a mistake, McGilchrist asks, by listening too much to this one part of our mind? Have we patterned ourselves and our world too much on its utilitarian and functional worldview?
There's fascinating evidence from the neuropsychological literature that when people are relying only on the left hemisphere, their world becomes fragmented. Their vision of the world is of bits that don't really connect with one another. And Louis Sass has written brilliantly, I think, about the way in which this fragmentation, which is so characteristic a part of modern thought, is comparable to the mind of the schizophrenic. And he draws a lot of subtle and brilliant parallels.
Seems to me that one could do a kind of parallel study of modernism and phenomena in psychopathology, and that each could, in a way, illuminate the other. And the thing that I think these two phenomena really have in common is a kind of exaggerated self-consciousness that involves all kinds of paradoxes. One of which is that certain kinds of self-consciousness actually result in the fragmentation or the dissolving of the self. And I think one of the useful things about a phenomenon like schizophrenia is that it makes you realize that there actually is a real phenomenon there, and we realize that when we see its absence.
The traditional view of what happens to the self in schizophrenia is that a loss of rationality leaves the self prey to the irrational. Sass, however, who has spent his professional life studying and treating schizophrenia sufferers, like Peter Arakawa, argues that the exact opposite is true, that the self in schizophrenia is destroyed by its own self-scrutinizing rationality. Too much, undiluted, left hemisphere activity.
If you want to try to sum up what schizophrenia is really all about, the really prominent features are captured by the terms hyperreflexivity and alienation. Hyperreflexivity, by that I mean a kind of self-consciousness. I don't just mean the self-consciousness of an adolescent, but rather it's the schizophrenic self-consciousness is something much more disruptive of the normal spontaneous flow of experience and of behavior. And it can also happen intellectually, so that one becomes sort of aware of one's own thinking.
You know, his term of self-reflexivity, I think, is very appropriate. I mean, there is a very intensive sense of self-consciousness. My mind would be constantly thinking, and it would be a way of using the brush to get that stuff that's inside outside.
They can get very engaged in a process of watching their own mind, and they will sometimes almost feel that they can kind of see the cognitive operations going on inside their skull. Or they may just sort of think about thinking, and they may begin to analyze themselves too much. It could be extremely debilitating and alienating for the person.
This was like reading a book, a hard book, and your mind starts to burn, and you can't put it down. Yeah, that's what it's like.
So a scrutinizing self-consciousness that is not relaxed and able to just accept itself ends up leading to an experience of there being no self.
For Sass, the schizophrenic world is where the rationality of the interpreter of the left hemisphere has unpicked the self and run out of control. The question is that our world too?
In schizophrenia, the left hemisphere is doing most of the processing of information. The left hemisphere tends to see a thing as bits of things that don't necessarily cohere at all, and is most at home, actually, with things that present themselves as rather novel lumps of little bits. And so one gets a sort of world which is alien, which the more one looks at it, the more bizarre it seems, from which one feels distinct, which appears mechanical, functional, but also rather frightening in the case of the schizophrenic. And these feelings of alienation, these feelings of a sort of existential angst that there is no real meaning to anything, it also seems to be a key aspect of both modernism and postmodernism.
I called the painting The Judgment. I suppose the figure is myself, is protection.
Patients with schizophrenia sometimes describe themselves as mechanisms, and they can't relate parts of their experience. I mean, that is something that happens to all of us.
So tell me about this one.
Well, my idea was that we have space and time, sort of concepts that are structured in the mind. The brain is a clock.
I think that there was a coherent self that has become increasingly unravelled or increasingly unsustainable. And I think that's to do with the way in which modern culture fragments and alienates and is similar to the worldview of the schizophrenic. And I think that one can cease to be in touch with whatever it is that helps one with that sense of coherence, and that increasingly we do find that life is fragmented. And I think it then becomes easier to think of all one's experiences and things that happen to one as this immense heap of little things, and where the self is in it, who one identifies there, what one identifies, is a difficult concept.
Did I have a strong sense of self when I was schizophrenic? It was different because there was much more going on in my brain. I would go to sleep simply to turn off my brain.
What was going on in there?
Everything possible. Let's see.
And where were you in the midst of this?
I was a witness. I was a witness to it all.
It was a frightening place to get to in the search for whatever it is inside us that makes us feel like individuals.
Along with the freedom that individualism gives is also the vulnerability that comes with it. Now, I would argue that these two aspects are closely related to the two directions in which this particular kind of modern self-consciousness about the mind can develop. On the one hand, we can feel that our mind is all-powerful and in a way is the God-like source of everything. But on the other hand, we also make our mind into an object of attention. And by doing that, we make it just another thing among things, potentially just a mechanism. And so the modern sense of self can therefore veer back and forth between this incredible grandiosity and this incredible feeling of utter impotence. And that's the kind of problematizing of the self that we see both in madness and in modernism.
So this is what has become of the liberated self that Shakespeare uncovered. A narrative, yes, but free-floating, cut adrift, without any author to anchor it in place. A postmodern, anxious self.
Interesting what happens in postmodernism is that we feel as though there is no way of breaking out of the world that we have constructed, this scheme, as it were. We're aware that we have set up a scheme, and we say the scheme is everything. And so we're reduced to going round like a mouse in a treadmill, around these same concepts, limited by what the left brain is offering us. And that is the price we pay for believing too strongly in the model of the left brain.
But that model of a rational, utilitarian, left-brain world, which we have lived with for the last 300 years, is changing. The gap between what we have always felt ourselves to be and what science has insisted we are is closing.
What's exciting about what is happening now is that the theoretical vocabulary of science is developing in a way that allows us to think about the self not as a thing, but as a process. And moreover, as a process which comes trailing the clouds of our experience of what it's like to be. We've got theories that look as if they can do for the self what we wanted, which is not to explain it away, but to help us understand where it fits in. For example, if you think of something like a whirlpool, it's got a position in space, characteristics that you could compare with other things, but it's not a thing at all. It's an event. It's a process. Moreover, it is a process that actively maintains itself.
This could be how science restores the self as a real entity. The self may be only a story, but in the way that a vortex is only water. If so, then once the self had emerged from nothing more than the swirl of the story, then the self would be as we feel it to be, the center and focus of our story, with real power to direct its flow.
Now, perhaps if the brain is like that, then our sense of what it's like to be can not be explained away, but explained and made part of a richer scientific theory.
And there are already scientists out there trying to show how this self as a process might actually work, and where physically it might be.
In order to understand how our self is generated in the brain, I think we have to look at the level of the electromagnetic field in the brain. Our brains generate an electromagnetic field, and it's been known for more than a century that they do. It's been used in EEG for a long time, but it's always thought that it doesn't really have any function. And what I'm trying to demonstrate is that, in fact, our self is made up of this field. The way that we normally understand how the brain works is rather like the way we understand how a computer works. Electricity in a computer travels down the wire from one circuit to another, and in the brain, electricity in the form of ions travel from one nerve to another. But one of the features of these ions is that they are electric particles, so they generate an electromagnetic field. And it's the kind of field that's used to transmit TV signals or radio signals, and it's the kind of thing that moves magnets. It's a force that is distributed through space. And what that means is that all of the information that is transmitted through the nerves is also represented in the field. It's kind of reflected in the field of the brain.
And for McFadden, it is in this field that we should search to find the self.
The important thing about any concepts that we have in our mind is that they are complex. And what we know about neurons is when they deal with complex concepts, they take them to pieces. And you can then process that information, but you can't build them back up again. So in order to provide meaning to a concept like the self, we need something that can handle the concept holistically as a whole unit. And that's where the field comes in, because fields integrate information. So that seems to correspond much more closely to our conscious mind, because all of the information will be there. It'll all be there in the same time frame, and it will all be integrated. In my theory, there is a place where the self lives, and that's in the electromagnetic field.
In McFadden's theory, the self has the same kind of power over our story as the vortex has over the water. That power, he believes, restores to us something critical that the interpreter denied us, our free will.
The interesting thing about neurons is that they are actually sensitive to the electromagnetic field. Although they generate an electromagnetic field, that field can loop back to influence whether or not they fire, whether they send a signal to another neuron downstream. So that means that the field that is generated by the brain will actually influence how neurons fire. And if it does that, then they will influence our actions. And that's, I think, what corresponds to our conscious will.
But is this enough? Whether the self is the electromagnetic field, a sort of postmodern ghost in the machine, or simply the narrator function of one side of our brain, is it all we are?
We shouldn't make the grand mistake of identifying ourselves with that little wafer-thin, highly conscious, highly vigilant, narrative-spinning bit, because that's not most of who and what I am, nor is it even probably the best of who and what I am.
Andy Clark works on artificial consciousness, yet surprisingly, he too feels that to place too much faith on the rational self may be a scientific and personal mistake.
I think that there are significant issues here for us as for everyone, but for us as a society. And one of the reasons that I find this sort of nascent little study of the self interesting is that it kind of matters. It's not just a scientific curiosity. It actually matters. It's maybe the thing that matters most to all of us.
How much it matters seems unaffected by how much we know. A whole industry has grown up, dedicated to helping the fragile modern self hold together.
You know, I work in 80 countries, and I've had 35 million people get my tapes, and I've had about 3 million people come through these seminars.
Where once we turned to priests for reassurance, today it is to people like Anthony Robbins.
Most of the people here, they want more of something, and many times they don't know what it is.
Good evening, Great Britain! How y'all doing out there?
And most people, their idea of their self is their biography, and they repeat it over and over and over again. And I think that most people are caught up in that story. And most people's story is what's keeping them from experiencing their true self. So breaking through that story, and no one lives outside it completely, because it's a part of our culture. Human beings are storytellers. I'm a storyteller. What you want to do is get better at telling empowering stories to yourself about yourself instead of disempowering ones about what you cannot do.
But is a more empowering story really the answer to what lies at the core of our being? Our culture is still wedded to the idea that what matters is the utilitarian, rational, scientific. But there's another view, that the rational can limit understanding too.
In certain cultures, the narrative spinning element spirals out of control because of the way those cultures present all the rest to themselves. In a culture where that notion of a core sense of being is not taken very seriously because maybe it's perceived to be unscientific or whatever, then all you're left with in some way is all of that storytelling. And that may then spin out of control. You just think, hey, the only way to really be me is to have a really interesting story to tell. I mean, brains like ours are just built to take seriously the stories they tell about themselves, and they're built to merge with the cultural settings in which they find themselves. So yeah, we should be careful what we put out there, because it's all coming back in.
We're living in a world of such massive change, and one of the most important of the 6 human needs I believe people have is a need for certainty. So that need for reassurance comes because there's so much uncertainty in the world. My view is have them find that certainty within themselves that they can access. Otherwise, they're dependent upon me or some other guru, and I'm not a guru.
Here we go. 1.
So this is where the modern self has ended. We freed ourselves from the confines of medieval religion and declared that with a self, there was no need for a soul. Yet here we are, strangely adrift, incomplete. Perhaps science itself is the storyteller, trying to make what sense it can of our lives. And now what it finds is that we are not convinced. As we each get older, the concerns of the self diminish. We hear that quieter part of us we left in childhood. And we ask, not who am I, but what am I? Next week we explore the deeper question. What is it that pulled the self into existence in the first place?